The vet didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and called the police. The clinic was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that hums beneath fluorescent lights and the faint ticking of a wall clock no one notices until something feels off. And in the center of that stillness stood a German shepherd who did not belong to silence, because everything about him carried tension, like a memory that refused to fade, like a soldier who had never been told the war was over. And yet, just hours earlier, he had been nothing more than a hopeful addition to a small American family trying to stitch something whole out of what life had quietly taken from them. The Hayes family didn't come looking for something extraordinary. They came looking for something gentle, something that could sit beside an 8-year-old girl and remind her that the world was still safe, still kind, still capable of love that didn't leave. And when Olivia Hayes first saw him at the shelter, sitting perfectly still behind a chain-link gate, she thought she had found exactly that, because he wasn't barking like the others. He wasn't pacing or whining or pressing himself forward for attention. He simply watched, calm, alert, eyes steady as if measuring every movement in the room. And there was something about that stillness that felt respectful, almost human, almost like he was waiting to be chosen, not hoping for it, just waiting, as if he already knew how these things went. Daniel Hayes noticed it too, though his reaction was quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that comes from recognition you don't want to admit out loud, because Daniel had seen that look before, not in a shelter, not behind a gate, but across open land under skies that never seemed to end, where every second mattered and every instinct could mean the difference between coming home or not. And when the shelter volunteer mentioned the dog had been listed as a former police K-9 with no available records, something in Daniel's chest tightened, not in fear, not exactly, but in the way old memories press forward when they sense something familiar in the present, something unfinished. Lily didn't see any of that. She just saw a dog who didn't scare her, a dog who didn't jump or bark or overwhelm the space around him. And when she stepped closer, small sneakers against the concrete floor, the German shepherd lowered his head just slightly, not submissive, not afraid, but aware, gentle in a way that felt intentional, like he understood her size, her quiet voice, the careful way she reached out her hand, and when her fingers brushed the side of his neck. He didn't flinch, he didn't move, he simply stayed, breathing slow, steady, present, and that was enough, that was everything. They named him Rex on the drive home, though the name felt more like a placeholder than something earned, because there was a weight to him that didn't match something so simple. But Lily smiled when she said it, and that mattered more than anything else in that moment. And for a brief stretch of time, maybe a few hours, maybe just until the sun began to dip low behind the houses on their street, it felt like the right decision, like something good had finally found its way back to them. But peace, real peace, doesn't carry tension in its shadows. And as evening settled in, Daniel began to notice the small things, the details that most people would miss, but that stood out to him like quiet alarms. The way Rex positioned himself near the front door without being told. The way his ears shifted not toward random sounds, but toward specific frequencies, distant engines, a passing siren blocks away, the subtle crackle of a neighbor's radio drifting through an open window, and each time, Rex didn't react like a pet. He reacted like he was processing, categorizing, assessing, his body still but his awareness sharp, controlled, disciplined. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Daniel woke without knowing why. The house wrapped in darkness, the air still, and from down the hallway came the faintest sound, not a bark, not a growl, just movement, deliberate and quiet. And when he stepped out of bed and followed it, he found Rex sitting outside Lily's room, not lying down, not resting, but sitting upright, eyes fixed on the door, listening, guarding, and for a moment, Daniel didn't see a dog. He saw something else entirely, something trained, something that had not forgotten its purpose. And as he stood there in the dim light, the realization settled slowly, heavily, like something he had hoped he was wrong about. Because whatever Rex was, he wasn't just a rescue. And somewhere deep beneath that calm exterior, there was a story that hadn't been told yet, one that hadn't ended, one that might already be finding its way back to them. Morning came quietly, the kind of pale gray light that slips through curtains before the world has fully decided to wake. And inside the Hayes house, nothing looked out of place, nothing sounded wrong, but something felt different, like the air itself was holding its breath, and Daniel could not shake the image of Rex sitting outside Lily's door, still and watchful, as if guarding something no one else could see. And when he stepped into the kitchen, the faint smell of coffee grounds and last night's dishes lingering in the sink, he found the dog already there, positioned near the back entrance, head slightly lowered, eyes shifting toward him with that same calm awareness that did not belong to a pet, not entirely. And for a moment, neither of them moved, man and dog standing in a silence that carried more questions than answers. Olivia followed a few minutes later, her robe pulled tight against the early chill, hair loosely tied back, and she smiled when she saw Rex, the kind of soft, hopeful smile that had been rare in their home over the past year, because to her, this was working. This was what they needed, something steady, something grounding, and she knelt slightly, offering a gentle greeting, but Rex did not rush forward, did not wag or nudge. He simply acknowledged her presence, a subtle shift of posture, respectful, measured, and Olivia did not notice the difference, not the way Daniel did, because she was looking for comfort, not patterns. Lily came running down the hallway moments later, her small feet light against the wooden floor, and the energy in the room shifted instantly, brighter, warmer, and for the first time since entering the house, Rex moved without hesitation, stepping toward her with a softness that seemed reserved only for her, lowering his head so she could wrap her arms around his neck, her laughter quiet but genuine, and Daniel watched closely, noticing how Rex adjusted his weight, how he leaned just enough to support her but never enough to overwhelm, how his breathing slowed to match her rhythm. And it struck him again. This was not instinct alone. This was training layered with something deeper, something intentional. Breakfast passed in a gentle rhythm. The clink of silverware, the low hum of a morning news broadcast in the background, and Rex positioned himself at a distance that allowed him to observe everything. Not begging for food, not pacing, just watching, his ears shifting at sounds that no one else reacted to, a delivery truck down the street, a distant siren fading into the distance, the faint buzz of a radio frequency cutting through static, and each time, his body responded in subtle ways. A tightening of posture, a slight tilt of the head, as if cataloging every detail. And Daniel felt that quiet tension build again, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles into your bones until you cannot ignore it anymore. Later that morning, Olivia suggested taking Rex to the veterinarian. Just a routine check, something responsible, something normal, and Daniel agreed. Though something about the word normal felt misplaced now, like they were trying to fit something unfamiliar into a shape it did not belong in. But he said nothing, because Lily was already excited, already talking about picking out a new collar, already imagining walks in the park and afternoons in the yard, and Daniel did not want to take that from her, not yet. The drive to the clinic was quiet, the hum of the engine steady, sunlight breaking through the windshield in soft patterns, and Rex sat in the back seat without shifting, without restlessness, his gaze fixed not on the passing scenery but on the space between, as if listening for something beyond what the eye could see. And once, just once, Daniel caught him glancing at the rearview mirror, their eyes meeting briefly, and in that moment, there was recognition, not of each other, but of something shared, something understood without words, and Daniel looked away first. The clinic itself was small, clean, the scent of antiseptic mixing with the faint presence of animals who had passed through before, and the waiting room held its usual quiet tension, a cat in a carrier, a small dog resting against its owner's feet, soft murmurs of conversation. But when Rex entered, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was difficult to explain, not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle tightening, a pause in the room's natural rhythm, as if something had changed without anyone naming it, and Rex stood still beside Lily, calm but alert, scanning, processing, present in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten again, because whatever they had brought into this place, it was not just a dog waiting to be checked. It was something carrying a history that had not yet revealed itself, something that had already begun to ripple outward, quietly, steadily, like the first signs of a storm you cannot yet see but can feel approaching. The phone call lasted less than a minute, but in that short span of time, something invisible shifted, something that did not make a sound yet seemed to echo through the room. And when Dr. Whitaker lowered the phone, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm a casual observer, but just enough for Daniel to notice, just enough for the weight of the moment to settle deeper into his instincts. Because this was no longer uncertainty, this was confirmation moving, quietly beneath the surface. Rex stood still beside Lily, but there was a new tension in him now, subtle yet undeniable, his body no longer simply present but engaged, as if something within him had registered the shift before anyone spoke it aloud. His ears angled toward the hallway, toward the front of the clinic, toward something unseen, and Daniel followed that line of awareness instinctively, his own senses sharpening in a way he had not felt in years, a quiet readiness settling into his posture without conscious thought. Olivia looked between them, confusion beginning to replace the earlier comfort she had carried into the room, her voice soft but edged with concern as she asked what was happening, and Dr. Whitaker hesitated for a fraction of a second, choosing his words carefully, explaining that he had contacted authorities to verify the information linked to Rex's microchip, that it was standard procedure when encountering something outside normal records, and while his tone remained calm, the implication beneath it was clear. This situation had moved beyond routine, beyond simple explanations. Lily tightened her arms around Rex again, her small frame pressing against his side, and for the first time since entering the clinic, Rex lowered his head slightly toward her, not in submission, not in fear, but in reassurance, a quiet gesture that spoke of connection rather than command, and Daniel felt something shift inside him at that, because whatever Rex had been trained to do, whatever role he had once served, there was something else there too, something that could not be programmed, something that responded to a child's trust with a kind of gentleness that no system could replicate. Minutes passed slowly, stretching in a way that made the ticking of the wall clock louder than it should have been, each second carrying a quiet anticipation, and outside, the muted sound of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot reached them through the walls, not loud, not urgent, just present. But Rex reacted immediately, his posture tightening, his gaze shifting toward the door with a focus that left no doubt. He knew that sound, not the specific vehicle, but the pattern of arrival, the significance behind it, and Daniel's breath slowed as he recognized it too, not the details, but the feeling, the sense that something official had entered the space, something that did not belong to ordinary routines. The door to the clinic opened moments later, the soft chime above it echoing faintly down the hallway, followed by measured footsteps, calm, controlled, and the low murmur of voices speaking in tones that carried authority without raising volume. And Rex did not move toward the sound. He did not bark or growl. He simply watched, every muscle aligned, every sense engaged, and Daniel understood then that whatever was about to happen. Rex had been here before, not this exact place, not this exact moment, but situations like this, moments where attention shifted, where decisions were made quietly, but carried weight beyond the room. Olivia reached for Daniel's hand, her grip light but steady, grounding herself in something familiar, and Daniel returned it without looking away from the door, his focus fixed, his mind moving through possibilities he could not yet fully form. And when the footsteps drew closer, when the presence at the edge of the hallway became more defined, the air seemed to hold itself in a kind of suspended stillness, as if the space between what had been and what was about to be had narrowed to a single breath. Rex's eyes flicked briefly to Daniel then, just for a moment, and in that glance there was something that went beyond instinct, beyond training, something that felt almost like acknowledgement, like a silent understanding shared between two beings who had both known what it meant to stand at the edge of the unknown and hold their ground. And Daniel felt that connection settle into him, quiet but certain, because whatever came through that door, whatever truth followed behind those measured footsteps, one thing had already become clear: Rex was not just part of the situation, he was at the center of it, and everything that happened next would unfold around him. The footsteps stopped just outside the examination room, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a quiet precision that carried intention, and for a brief moment, there was only the soft hum of the clinic and the steady rhythm of breathing within the room, as if time itself had chosen to slow down and wait. And then the door opened with a controlled, deliberate motion, revealing two individuals dressed in plain clothes that did not need insignia to convey authority, their posture composed, their presence calm but unmistakable, and the air shifted again, deeper this time, as if something long hidden had finally stepped into the light. Rex did not bark, did not retreat, did not show fear. Instead, he straightened slightly, his body aligning in a way that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen discipline shaped into instinct. His gaze fixed, attentive, and for the first time since they had known him, there was no ambiguity in his posture, no softness, no uncertainty, only recognition, and Daniel felt it immediately, that quiet confirmation settling into place, because whatever these individuals represented, Rex knew them, or at least he knew what they stood for. One of the agents stepped forward, his voice low, respectful, introducing himself with a calm clarity that did not invite interruption, and he acknowledged the family with a nod that carried both courtesy and distance, explaining that they had received a call regarding a registered K-9 unit that had been listed as missing, and that the identification number matched a dog under restricted classification. And as he spoke, his eyes moved briefly toward Rex, not with surprise, not with doubt, but with recognition tempered by something else, something measured, something careful. Olivia tightened her grip on Daniel's hand, her confusion deepening into something more uncertain, because the words being spoken did not align with the reality she had understood, did not fit the image of the quiet dog her daughter had held onto just minutes ago. And Lily pressed closer to Rex, her small voice barely above a whisper as she asked if they were going to take him. And the question hung in the air, fragile, unanswered, carrying more weight than any formal explanation could hold. The second agent spoke then, his tone even, controlled, explaining that Rex, though that name did not appear in any official record, had once been part of a specialized K-9 program, a unit trained not only for detection but for situational awareness, for reading environments in ways that extended beyond standard commands, and that his disappearance months earlier had been classified as unresolved, not closed. Because assets like him were not simply replaced, they were accounted for, and every word was delivered without drama, without urgency, but with a quiet finality that made it clear this was not a misunderstanding. Daniel listened without interrupting, his mind moving through each detail, each implication, and when he looked at Rex again, he did not see a mystery anymore. He saw a history, a path that had not ended but had been interrupted, and the weight of that realization settled into him, because it meant that Rex's presence in their home had not been random. It had been a crossing of two stories that were never meant to meet, at least not like this. Rex shifted his gaze then, not toward the agents, not toward the door, but toward Lily, and something softened in that moment, something that did not belong to training or classification or any system that could be documented, and he lowered himself slightly, just enough for her to rest against him again, and the room seemed to pause, just for a heartbeat, as if even those who had come with purpose could not ignore the quiet bond unfolding in front of them. The first agent took a step closer, not aggressively, not abruptly, but with a measured intention, and he spoke again, explaining that they would need to verify Rex's condition, assess his status, determine whether he could be returned to duty or if other arrangements would need to be considered. And though his words were professional, there was a subtle shift in his tone, a recognition that this situation was not as simple as retrieving a missing unit, because the dog standing before them was no longer just an asset. He was something more, something that had already begun to change the space around him. Daniel finally spoke then, his voice steady, grounded, asking a question that was not confrontational but carried quiet weight, asking what would happen next. And the agent met his gaze directly, answering with honesty tempered by protocol, that Rex's history would need to be reviewed, that decisions would be made based on factors beyond this room, beyond this moment. And as those words settled, the silence that followed felt different from before, not uncertain, not tense, but full, as if the truth had finally taken its place in the open, and everything that came after would have to move around it, not avoid it. The room did not erupt into chaos. It did not fracture under raised voices or sudden movement. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something heavier, the kind of silence that comes when every person present understands that what happens next will matter in ways that cannot be undone. And Daniel felt it most of all, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not, the spaces between the words, the careful phrasing, The way the agents had chosen precision over explanation, and that told him everything he needed to know. This was not just about retrieving something lost. This was about control, about ownership, about a system that did not easily release what it had once claimed. Lily's arms remained wrapped around Rex, her small fingers gripping his fur just a little tighter now, and she did not speak again, not because she did not have questions, but because she understood in the way children sometimes do, without needing full explanations, that something important was being decided around her, something that involved the one thing in that room she had already chosen as her own. And Rex did not move away from her, did not shift under the weight of her hold. Instead, he adjusted again, subtly, placing himself between her and the agents without making it obvious. A small shift of position, a quiet line drawn without challenge, and Daniel saw it immediately. That protective instinct layered over discipline, and it stirred something deep in his chest, something that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with recognition. One of the agents took another step forward, slower this time, his hands visible, his posture open, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood the presence in front of him. He understood that this was not a situation that responded well to force or pressure, and his voice remained calm as he spoke again, explaining that they would need to run additional verification, that Rex would likely need to be transported for evaluation, that there were protocols in place designed to ensure proper handling of specialized K9 units, and each word was measured, respectful, but final in a way that left little room for interpretation. Olivia's voice broke the silence then, soft but firm, asking if there was any other option, if Rex could stay with them, at least for now. And there was something in her tone that carried more than a question. It carried hope. Fragile but present, the kind that refuses to let go even when the outcome feels uncertain. And the agent paused, just briefly, his gaze shifting from her to Lily, to the way the child held onto the dog, and something in his expression changed, not enough to alter his words, but enough to reveal that he understood the weight of what he was about to say. Daniel stepped forward then, not aggressively, not in opposition, but with a quiet steadiness that came from years of knowing when to stand and when to listen, and he asked a different question, one that did not challenge authority but sought clarity, asking whether Rex was considered a risk, whether there was any indication that his presence posed a danger, and the agent met his gaze directly, answering without hesitation that there was no such indication, that Rex's training was extensive, controlled, and that his behavior, from what they had observed, did not suggest instability, and that answer settled into the room with a different kind of weight, because it shifted the conversation not away from protocol, but toward possibility. Rex's ears moved slightly at the sound of Daniel's voice, his gaze flicking toward him again, and for a moment, there was that same quiet acknowledgement, that shared understanding that had passed between them before, and Daniel felt it settle into something firmer now, not just recognition, but connection, the kind that does not ask permission, the kind that forms in silence and holds its ground without needing explanation. The second agent spoke then, his tone softer, less formal, explaining that while the situation was not typical, there were circumstances where retired or reassigned K9 units could be placed into civilian care, but that such decisions required time, documentation, and verification, and as he spoke, the rigid structure of the moment seemed to loosen slightly, not enough to resolve anything, but enough to allow space for something else to exist alongside protocol, something human, something that acknowledged that this was no longer just about a missing unit being recovered. Lily finally spoke again, her voice small but steady, asking if Rex had a name before, and the question hung in the air, simple yet profound, because it cut through the layers of classification and training and returned to something more fundamental, identity, and the first agent glanced briefly at his partner before answering, his voice quieter now, less official, saying that the name on record had been Echo, and as the words settled into the room, Rex reacted, not dramatically, not with sudden movement, but with a subtle shift, a stillness that deepened, as if something long buried had been called back to the surface, and Lily repeated the name softly, testing it, feeling it, and for a moment, the tension in the room softened, just enough to remind everyone present that beneath the protocols and records and classifications, there was something else entirely, something that could not be documented, something that had already begun to choose where it belonged. The name lingered in the room long after it was spoken, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like something that had always been there waiting to be heard again. And Lily said it once more, softer this time. Echo. And the dog's ears lifted just slightly, his gaze shifting toward her in a way that no one could ignore, because it was not instinct, not coincidence, it was recognition, and in that quiet response, something changed, something deeper than protocol, deeper than classification, something that could not be written into any report or system. And even the agents felt it, though neither of them said it out loud. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest settling into something clearer now. Not confusion, not resistance, but understanding, because he had seen it before, not in a dog, but in people, in soldiers who carried two names, one given, one earned, one belonging to the past, one shaped by experience. And he realized then that Rex had not replaced Echo. Echo had simply been waiting beneath the surface, quiet, controlled, until something called him back. The first agent shifted his stance slightly, his posture less rigid now, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, still professional, still measured, but no longer distant, as if the moment had moved beyond procedure into something more personal, something that required not just authority but judgment. And he explained that Echo had been part of an experimental program, one that trained K9 units not only to respond but to anticipate, to read environments, to detect patterns before they fully formed, and that such training often came with complexities, behaviors that could not always be easily reintegrated into civilian life. And yet, as he glanced at the dog standing quietly beside a child who trusted him without hesitation, there was something in his expression that suggested this case did not follow the expected path. Olivia listened closely, her hand still wrapped in Daniel's, her eyes moving between the agents and the dog, and there was a shift in her now too, a quiet resolve forming beneath her concern, because whatever Echo had been, whatever role he had once filled, the reality in front of her was not a program or a classification. It was a presence, a living being who had already become part of their home. And she asked again, gently but firmly, what it would take for him to stay, not permanently, not yet, but long enough for them to prove that he belonged where he was. The second agent exchanged a brief glance with his partner, a silent conversation passing between them, and then he nodded slightly, explaining that there was a possibility, a temporary arrangement, a form of monitored placement while the case was reviewed, but that it would require agreement, cooperation, and a willingness to accept that the situation could change depending on what the investigation revealed. And though his words carried conditions, they also carried something else, something that had not been there before, a willingness to consider, to adapt, to acknowledge that not every outcome could be determined in advance. Daniel met his gaze and nodded once, a quiet agreement, not because he fully understood what lay ahead, but because he recognized the moment for what it was, an opening, a chance. And sometimes that was enough. Echo remained still, but his posture had softened again, just slightly, as if the tension that had held him in that rigid awareness was easing. And when Lily leaned against him once more, he lowered himself to meet her, the movement slow, deliberate. And for the first time since the agents had entered, the room felt different, not resolved, not settled, but balanced, as if the weight that had pressed down on every breath had shifted just enough to allow something else to exist alongside it. Outside, the late afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and the world beyond the clinic continued as it always had, cars passing, people moving, unaware of the quiet turning point unfolding within those walls. And inside, no one rushed to speak, no one moved too quickly, because they all understood, in their own way, that this moment mattered, not because it solved anything, but because it changed the direction of what came next. And sometimes, that is where everything begins to shift, not in the answers, but in the space where people choose to wait, to trust, and to see what remains when the truth finally stands in the open. The sun had begun to lower by the time they stepped outside the clinic, its warm light stretching across the parking lot in long, quiet lines, and for the first time since the day had started, the world felt still, not empty, not silent, but settled, as if everything that had needed to surface had already done so. And now what remained was something simpler, something that did not need to be explained. The agents stood near their vehicle, speaking in low tones, their presence no longer pressing against the moment but existing alongside it. And when one of them turned back toward the Hayes family, there was no urgency in his movement, only a calm acknowledgement that whatever came next would not happen all at once. Daniel stood with his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture no longer tense, no longer guarded, but grounded, the way it used to be when he had finally learned that not every situation required control, some only required presence. And beside him, Olivia watched Lily, her expression soft, steady, carrying a quiet gratitude that did not need to be spoken. Lily knelt on the pavement, her small hands resting against Echo's shoulders, her forehead pressed gently against his, and she whispered his name again, not testing it this time, not questioning it, but accepting it. And Echo lowered his head just enough to meet her, his breathing slow, even. The tension that had once lived in every part of him now eased into something that looked, for the first time, like peace. One of the agents approached, his steps measured but unguarded, and he spoke with a tone that no longer carried only authority, but something else, something quieter, explaining that the temporary placement would begin immediately, that they would return in the coming weeks to evaluate, to observe, to determine what Echo's future would look like. And though the words were procedural, they did not feel cold. They felt careful, as if even he understood that this was not simply a case to be closed, but a story still unfolding. Daniel nodded once, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, because he knew what it meant to carry a past that did not fit neatly into the present, and he also knew what it meant to be given a chance to stand somewhere new, even if that ground was uncertain. Echo turned his gaze toward the agent for a brief moment, and there was no resistance there, no challenge, only awareness. And then he looked back to Lily, choosing without needing to move, choosing without needing to be told, and in that quiet decision, something settled fully, something that no system could override. The agents left without ceremony, their vehicle pulling away slowly, blending back into the rhythm of the street, and as the sound faded, the space they had occupied did not feel empty. It felt open, like something had been released rather than taken. Daniel exhaled, a long breath he had not realized he was holding, and he placed a hand gently on Echo's back, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm. And for a moment, there were no questions left, no need to define what this was or what it would become, because the answer was already there, in the way the dog leaned slightly into that touch, not out of training, not out of command, but out of something chosen. They drove home in the quiet glow of evening, the sky painted in soft shades of gold and blue, and Echo sat in the back seat again. But this time his posture was different, not rigid, not watchful, but relaxed, his head resting just enough to show that whatever he had been carrying, he no longer needed to hold it alone. And when they pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it had that morning, simple, familiar, unchanged, and yet everything inside it had shifted. That night, there were no distant sounds pulling Echo's attention, no rigid stillness at the door, no silent patrol through the hallway. Instead, he lay just outside Lily's room, not sitting upright, not guarding, but resting, his body finally at ease, his breathing deep and steady. And Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, watching, understanding something he had not been able to name before, that sometimes the strongest instinct is not to protect, not to respond, not to stay alert, but to let go, to trust that the place you are in is enough, that the people beside you are enough. The house settled into sleep, the quiet kind that does not carry tension, only presence. And in that stillness, Echo did not wake, did not shift, did not listen for something beyond the walls, because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to prepare for, only a moment that asked nothing of him except to be still, and he answered it, not as a unit, not as a designation, but as something far simpler, something that had finally found its way home.